Right. I think we'll make a start. Yeah, firstly, welcome everyone to this Waterwise conference or webinar, I should say. I'm Nathan Richardson. I'm head of policy at Waterwise. So yeah, big welcome to today's webinar, which is all about discernible dual flush buttons on our toilets. And it's really targeted at the water industry, water efficiency and water regulations enforcement community. But I know we have some others here from manufacturers and BMA as well. So to give the session a little bit of context, we know we face a climate and environmental emergency. If you can go back a slide, please, Laura, thanks. We face a water supply deficit in England of 3.5 to 4 billion litres of water a day if we want to have secure water supplies, and if we want to adapt to climate change, allow for growth and protect the environment as well. So at least half of this huge deficit needs to come through demand management, and that means reducing leakage, reducing wastage and reducing consumption. So it's crucial that the water that we use is used carefully and efficiently. And if we don't, then not only are we wasting water, but we're also responsible for the extra carbon emissions that are associated with getting that water to us. So dual flush toilets should be part of the solution. They should be part of the demand management toolkit to meet this deficit. And as we know, they were brought in about 20 years ago to allow people to choose a smaller flush option, thereby saving water. However, that only really works if people know what button gives the short flush. And as we'll hear today, often they don't, despite what the regulations require. So 9 months ago, Waterwise, this issue was highlighted at the annual Waterwise conference. And today's webinar is really an opportunity to recap on why this issue still remains important and to hear about some recent research and consider how this issue can be addressed. So next slide, please, Laura, thanks. So yeah, in terms of today's agenda, in a minute, we'll hear from Alison Murphy from the Water Efficiency Manager at SES Water on why this issue is important from a water resources perspective. We'll then hear from Paul Millard from Water Regs UK Limited about what the law says regarding the buttons and dual flush toilets. We'll then have a couple of presentations from two of the testing houses, from David and Ian, who will talk about the issue from their perspective. And Ian will also be running through some of the research that they've been doing recently into this issue. And then we'll have a panel Q&A. So we'll have all the speakers plus Simon Warburton from the NSF testing house and Andy McLean from the Bathroom Manufacturers Association as well will be joining the Q&A. And then we're aiming to finish at 5 o'clock. So next slide, please, Laura. So yeah, in terms of how we're going to run today's webinar, there's quite a lot of people on the call. So attendees are muted with the cameras off, but you can share your general thoughts and comments through the chat box. And I can see that people have already started doing that, which is great. And if you've got any questions, you can pose them using the Q&A box. And it will help me if when you ask a question in the Q&A box, if you can flag up who that question is for as well. So that when we get to the Q&A session in about 3/4 of an hour's time, then I'll pick up the questions from the Q&A box and pose them to the people on the panel. So yeah, just to flag that the session is being recorded, and we will be looking to share the recording afterwards to the people who've registered to attend today. So I think without any sort of further ado, I'll hand over to Alison Murphy from SES Water, who's going to give us a bit of the context in terms of why this issue is important for water resources. Over to you, Alison.
Thanks, Nathan. Just to say this session is due to finish at 3 o'clock, not 5, for those of you who picked that up. But yes, and I'm going to start with by apologising to those people that might have heard some of how discussing this at the Waterwise conference early this year. But it's something that I've been working on as part of the toilet task and finish group that's part of the water efficiency strategy steering group. So I've been looking at it a long time, and so it's been really good that we've to get to this point and see some traction on this matter. So if I could have the next slide, please. So I'm going to just sort of outline, as I said, why this is important. Nathan's already talked about it in general terms, but yes, the much of England is classed as water stress, as many of you would know, and that managing demand is key to trying to address the management of water resources, because supply side solutions are costly and potentially environmentally damaging, and so it is really key. We're having to move towards being resilient to more extreme droughts in the future. In 2040, we have to move into being resilient to a 1 in 500 year drought. So that's quite a big step from where we are now, and it does mean quite a lot of additional changes in terms of managing demand that we will need by that point and beyond, if we're able to accommodate growth and protect the environment. So the government have set out sort of a target in their 25-year environment plan that per capita consumption, so consumption each person for household use, should drop to around 110 litres per person per day. The current level is around 142. So that might sound like a lot of water, but once you sort of divide it up into water use around the home, we really do need to tackle all areas and to get to that target and lower. And of course, it matters in terms of affordability, because it will impact on water and sewage bills as well, and therefore make it easier for people to pay their bills. So we need to really make saving water easy. People don't want to have to think about it too much. The way that people use water is complex, and we've done a lot of work in trying to understand behaviours. And but a lot of the time, that people's base level of understanding of how they use water and what makes a difference is quite low, and engagement in it is low. They don't want to have to think about it, so we have to work on making it the easy route, so that we can reduce consumption. So because we do know that behaviour change is going to be needed, but what switches can we make to the design of water use fittings that makes it simple and easy for people to waste less? And we know that to do that, then we would need to work in collaboration with industry, with government and regulators to reach the best solutions. This is one part of that. Next slide, please. So what is the problem? So we started looking at this a few years ago. They might know that there are 2 buttons, and they might know that they're in principle that one is for a lower flush and one is for a higher flush, but that is actually a matter in itself. But the key thing is, do they know which is which? So we did a survey a couple of years ago that showed that only just over a quarter of people knew which button on their toilet was a short flush and which was a long flush. And in the same year, Thames Water did a quiz on social media, and they showed people different buttons, and they found that the percentage of people that got it right was really quite variable, and it depended on the design. The highest level of confusion seemed to be around where the small button was inside the larger one. And we acknowledge it's not just valve toilets. Dual flush siphons, where the user has to press and hold for a short flush, seem to be counterintuitive and can be confusing as well. So that's something that would also need to be tackled. But today we're focusing on those with the buttons, which are the predominant type of toilet. So apologies for a few stats here, but I just wanted to calculate up what difference it would make. So we know that around 30% of water used in the home is used to flush the toilets. So that's about 43 litres per person daily out of the total of 142 that I mentioned earlier. And obviously that will differ in different families, depending on whether they're at home during the day or not, but that is an average. So the next point is that most dual flush toilets use 4 litres for a short flush and 6 litres for a long one. So the difference, if they're, by using the correct button, is about 2 litres. And often we'd show people, the Coca-Cola type bottle to try and show them that so they can visualize it, because it's quite difficult when you don't really see it, that amount of water, to see what difference that makes. And we also know that on average that people need to use, if they were doing things, when they needed to, they should, without getting too fine a point on it, they should need to use about 5 short flushes and 1 long flush per day. So it does make quite a lot of difference. So in terms of calculating an excess usage, if we say, based on our original surveys, that about 70% of people are confused about which button to use, and if we also say that they have a 50-50 chance of selecting the right or wrong button, and actually that is possibly being a bit generous, because we think that actually some people are consistently pressing the wrong button, because it's not that they just don't know, they actually think that what is a short flush is actually a long one. But anyway, if we go with the 50-50, then they would each use an extra 1 litre on average. So that's 5 litres a day. And if you proportion that across all users, including the 30% that do know, and hopefully are getting it correct, then on average, each person is using an extra, or wasting an extra 3.5 litres a day. So that's about 2.5% of their total usage. So it could really make a difference if we can tackle this along with other things and step towards that 110 target. So I just wanted to show you what that would mean if we scaled that up across the UK. It would mean that that wastage, or that amount that we could save, is 238 million litres per day, which is enough. If you would, we often use Olympic-sized swimming pools, but I have gone for the Royal Albert Hall, 2.5 of those. So it really would make a difference if everybody knew which button to press. So I'm just going to finish with a bit about what I think the solution is, or what I thought at the time, and just sort of show you where this started. So, we really do need to find out what people understand in more detail by surveying consumers to test the effect of the different designs, and how much difference, the buttons, difference in terms of their size would it make? And then we could use that and decide, right, so if a significant percentage of those surveys can correctly identify the small flush button, then this could be considered to meet the criteria of readily discernible, which Paul's going to talk about next, and that potentially the instructions on the operation, can be clearly marked in that way. There's a bit of background noise. Paul, maybe you could go on mute. Then I'd suggest that we would then use those survey results to set those testing rules, and the product approval schemes could look at their guidance on the buttons and to interpret what is readily discernible. And ideally that it does need to be readily discernible without the need for a sticker, because it may not be used, and consumers may not like that. If the designs are all really clear, then we wouldn't need to do anything further. But there's a backstop. The requirements can be enforced by the water company regulations teams that carry out inspections on new builds, for examples. But they clearly, we can't be at all properties and therefore that is very much sort of a kind of a last resort in terms of identifying where problems exist, but that is something that they can do. And we want to work with the BMA, manufacturers, house builders, to roll out any changes at the right pace. And the last thing I just wanted to point out is that we do need to raise awareness with customers. Some publicity happened around the time of the Waterwise conference, because Tom Heap was very interested in this as well. But we want people to get to know their toilet, because the changes will take time to implement, and most households don't change their toilet for a number of years. And not all products are approved, so we need to educate the public as much as we can. I could say as a rule of thumb, they can measure the length of time that each flush takes to fill, but I know that isn't always obvious, but it is something that it does help with some people. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison, for setting the scene and the sort of context and why you and Waterwise and other organisations are interested in this issue. So next we're going to move on to hear from Paul Millard, who's a technical manager at Waterregs UK Limited, about actually what do the regulations actually say about discernible dual flush buttons. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Nathan. So what I'm going to talk through today is just about what the regulations are, and for those of you that are unfamiliar about the regulations, what their intentions are. So in general terms, the water fittings regulations and bylaws in Scotland protect public health, prevent contamination of the drinking water system, and then promote efficient use of water, which is what we've got of interest here today. In terms of where they apply to all aspects of plumbing systems that are provided from the public supply, which accounts for about 98% of properties in the UK today. And that's about 28 million properties currently. In terms of whose job it is to enforce these, this has been part of water companies' licenses since the introduction of public water supplies, and they're kind of responsible for looking at the regulations as they apply in both domestic, in commercial premises, and industrial premises, and they check against new and existing properties. So that gives us a flavour of the scale of the work that they've got. And in terms of this particular element, we're looking into Schedule 2 to the regulations, where we get the detailed information about WCs in particular, which is paragraph 25. And there's a subsection G there, which then talks specifically about the actuation, the initiation of those flushes, particularly where there are different volumes. And so in the first part, it talks about the method of actually actuating that actual flush. And in here, you can see that the key words are readily discernible. And then there's an and. And so in the second part of that, talks about the information that's displayed to users so they know how to activate the flush that they're looking to do. And here we can see that the keywords are the instructions that are clear and permanently displayed, whether that's on the system or nearby, so that people know how to then activate the flush that's required. So looking at when it comes to how does an enforcer then make those judgments as they go in to various buildings. One thing we'll note from the parts of the regulations is that there's no mention about shape, size, or markings. And so it's not prescriptive in how they should look, feel, or otherwise. And so from a legal perspective, we're kind of then reliant then on our theoretical person about how would they then see see this. The man on the Clapham omnibus, I think it was called, back in 1870 something. So this is our ordinary, reasonable person. How would they view this, and what would they be expected to do? So factors we need to consider when you're looking at enforcement is about the situation. Where is this particular water fitting placed? Could be in the home, could be in a public building, or it could be in a specialist facility or building. But it's not just that. It's also about the who's going to be expected to actually operate this. You know, are they able-bodied? Do they have impairments? Maybe physical, maybe visual. All of those things have to be satisfied when you're looking at, is it fit for purpose? Is it doing its job? So in these two examples, we're just going to quickly go through about what would an inspector do when he then approaches something like this. So the first element is he's looking to ascertain, is it readily discernible? Is it quite straightforward? Is it? And in this case, we can see that there is a small button and a larger button. And one is distinctly bigger than the other. So there's no real discrepancy about what might be small and what might be large. But what we don't know is what each one does. And so the second part is about the permanent instructions. And in these two examples, you can see that on the left-hand drawing, that there's a nice big sign, big arrow pointing to the small button, which actually does activate the small flush. And on the case on the right-hand side, where we've got, well, is it discernible? Well, there's a lever. That's the only thing to activate it. So then how does a person then determine which one to do? And the label there clearly explains how the function works. So in this case, the inspector might think these are reasonable and they've complied with the elements of the law. In this second case, in a cubicle only just down the adjacent to the one we saw before, we're seeing something a little bit different. So again, readily discernible, large button, very large button, very small button. Is there instructions? Yes, there's instructions, but in here we see the arrows pointing to the big button. And so is the user then supposed to assume that the big button operates the little flush? And unfortunately, it's the installer that's undone all of that good work, because it is actually still the same as the other cubicles. The little button does the little flush. But because the sign is now pointing in the wrong place, or during maybe some maintenance, the panel's been put in the wrong way round, all of that work has been undone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, highlighting some of the challenges there around, well, the intent of the law is clear. I think it's just how it's actually reflected in and applied sort of on the ground. So having heard about that, we're now going to go over to hear from a couple of the testing houses. So first of all, we're going to hear from David J, who's a business unit manager at Kiwa. And then we're going to hear from Ian Hughes, who's the approvals manager at RAS. And they're both going to give their sort of perspectives on the product sort of testing part of this story. And Ian is also going to present some recent research and changes that RAS are making to their processes and approach to this issue. So firstly, over to you, David.
Thanks, Nathan. Yeah, as Nathan said, good afternoon, everybody. I'm David J. I'm the business unit manager at Kiwa Water Tech. And if I can have the next slide, please, Laura. Yeah, just as way of a short introduction, Kiwa UK, we've been an accredited laboratory and have been submitting some test reports to RAS for RAS approval for almost 17 years now. But we also offer our own in-house certification scheme, which is the Kiwa UK Reg 4 certificate. We've been present in the UK since early 2000, but myself and my colleague Clive Hawkes, we joined in 2004. Our in-house certification offer has been available since 2002, so it has been around, albeit in a low-key kind of way. More recently, we are promoting it quite heavily as an alternative for some manufacturers. However, in saying that, just on a quick calculation, flushing devices only represent less than 1% of all our listings. So admittingly, it's not raising itself as a priority in this group of fittings for us to take any action with. Next slide, please, Laura. So I think we'll all show this slide today. Paul's just gone through it, and the requirements of Schedule 2, it does say it, the words are quite clear. It's readily discernible method and a permanent instruction. And what's the conclusion? We have a very ambiguous situation, and the outcome is not very ideal at all. Next slide, please, Laura. So, but this is not a new situation that we find ourselves in. We recall the discussions 20 years ago through the old RAS, PAG, and the technical committee systems that were in place at that time. Our interpretation through the Kiwi UK scheme still mirrors the discussions, and the outcome of those discussions are happening then. We recall them within Kiwi UK. We've got quite a fair amount of experience, and people remember quite frankly, going around the houses with this discussion. And how it was concluded, in our opinion, is the term readily discernible method meant that there was a separate actuator or a separate action, like 2 different buttons, or press and hold. Interestingly, at this point, size is not a factor for us at this point, because there's 2 parts, as Paul has mentioned earlier, there's 2 parts to this clause G. Next slide, please, Laura. So moving on to the second point. So we've got the two actuators. The device now must have instructions, and these instructions must be clear and permanent. However, an instruction can mean many things. It doesn't really need to be words or diagrams, illustrations, any kind of things like this that we would normally expect. If you can understand the button, or the buttons, or the combination of both, if you can understand it, the instruction works, in our opinion. And this shows that this was what was discussed many, many years ago. So additionally, when it talks about permanent, it doesn't have to really mean printed or etched in some of the examples already shown. If the instruction is permanent because it's part of the integral design of the fitting, for Kiwa, following the old interpretation, this also complies. So these 2 examples that we have found here, in our opinion, would comply, and we would certify on the basis that it meets both requirements. I do agree, mind, these are 2 very easy examples, and there are lots of examples out there that would be more problematic than these. But we would accept and issue a Kiwi UK Reg 4 if we were faced with these designs. Laura, my final slide. So this is why we're here today. Where do we go from here? Well, the regs in Schedule 2, it's there, but it's very much open to interpretation. And considering that significant volumes of this product group come to the market based on self-declarations as complying with these requirements, challenging these designs through water supplier enforcement I think is going to be incredibly difficult, really. Where we are, my interest is understanding who's driving this design to make it less discernible, if you can say it that. Where is that coming from? And I would like to see a much more detailed and focused research in this, because we need to understand, is the problem in domestic buildings? Because we had this discussion 20 years ago. The discussion at that point was that in a domestic situation, while it may be confusing, after the first few attempts, it's no longer a problem in a domestic issue, in a domestic installation. Public installations, meanwhile, are a different argument, and I can understand a lot of the confusion about it. But again, are we talking about discernible methods which are very, very clear in this? Where it is a single button without any kind of instruction, I can understand it's very clear for the water company to reject that installation. So for certification, on alignment of certification schemes, what I'm happy to engage with the other certifying bodies, but I think I would like to see significantly more focused data on where the issue is. I don't want to push manufacturers away. Many manufacturers are already doing this through self-declaration. So I think we have to be careful that we don't make certification even more bureaucratic or difficult for these manufacturers. Through the process of third-party testing, we also pick up other issues, and we can pick up where the inferior quality products are. And I think we have to be careful here that we're not resolving one issue, but creating other issues. And as I said, I'm happy to align and work with other certification schemes, but I think we need to be careful as well. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, David, and thanks for that bit of background as well about some of the discussions that were had 20 years ago around this, and sort of that sheds a bit of light sort of on how we've sort of ended up where we are today, but it doesn't necessarily mean we need to carry on in the same way into the future. So that's useful to have a few thoughts around that as well. Now we'll move over to Ian Hughes, who's the approvals manager at RAS, and he's going to talk in particular about some research that they've been doing and some changes that they're making to their testing processes to try and get round or get through this issue about public confusion about which buttons are doing what. So over to you, Ian.
Thanks very much, Nathan. Yeah, so as Nathan said, I'm Ian Hughes. I'm the approvals manager at RAS. I think I won't dawdle too much on this bit. I think David and Alison and Paul have all spent a little bit of time about what the regulations state. I would support what was highlighted by David in the fact that the phrase readily discernible is an ambiguous phrase. And I think likewise with the instruction, it falls into the level of ambiguous. And I think I would really support if there was some clarification that was issued by DEFRA to reinforce or to define some of these phrases. So, sorry. So I think as far as readily discernible is concerned, what we've looked at is going, well, okay, we need to try and understand how easy is it to understand these buttons. I think we've all come from a background where we've spent time looking at these products, and we probably have a bit more knowledge and understanding of how these buttons operate. And it really was quite important to us as an approval scheme to really understand what the man in the street felt when they were sort of tasked with the problem of identifying the lower flush button. So what we did was we commissioned an independent market research company to run a survey of 2,000 people. We looked at some of the designs that were in the general circulation, and we came up with 18 designs of our own that use some of the themes that existed. So some of the variabilities that we put into the design were where the button was actually marked or not marked. We varied the difference in the sizes between the two buttons, and the difference in the sizes on the marking if we have marking on there. And we also varied the marks in the number of markings that were on each one of the two buttons. When we surveyed the 2,000 people, what we did was we asked each person that was invited to take part in the survey was given 9 of the 18 designs, so that by the time we got to the end of it all, 1,000 people had looked at each one of the designs. We asked a very simple question: which button would you choose to obtain the short flush? Because basically that's the challenge that's facing the person when they go to flush the toilet. And this is some of the information that we got from the output. So as you can see here, we've got some examples of buttons. The one at the top left scored the best. The buttons were exactly the same size, and it was purely the marking that was on the button that showed there was 1 droplet or 3 droplets, and 92% of the people identified button A as the short flush. These 2 buttons here were identical in the outline, and all we did was change the ratio between the small button and the large button. On the top one, the smaller button was equated to 45% of the surface area compared to 55% of the surface area as a whole. And that achieved a 56% recognition. When we moved that to a split of 60-40, that achieved an 80% level of recognition. And we got very similar results with the circular button. I think what's more interesting is these 2 buttons in the bottom right-hand corner. We've got 2 identical buttons, but on the one on the right, we've specifically said the big button is the small flush with 3 little dots to indicate the flush. And that only, even though it was labeled clearly, only 60% of the population that were surveyed were able to identify which was the right button to press to get the short flush. So I think labeling in itself, if you've got buttons that are dissimilar in size, can actually be a bit misleading. When we look at this, we've got a number of different buttons. On this one hit on the top left, 80% of people thought the small button was the small flush. And if that was the case, that would be a very good result. But if that button was designed in such a way that the small button was designed to achieve a large flush, then actually 4 out of 5 people are going to get that button design wrong. Where you've got buttons that are dissimilar in shape, it can also be quite misleading and the public find it quite difficult to understand. And you've basically got a 50-50 split between that design. The bottom 2 left-hand buttons here, we've used exactly the same button design. All we've done is we've changed the marking by the size of the marking that appears on it. And you can see that the bigger the difference between the marking, the better the result gets. However, it still doesn't achieve a brilliant recognition when one of the marks is 1.5 times the size of the smaller marking. So I think the big outcomes on this, and I think from an efficiency calculations point of view, whether it's the water efficiency calculation for the entire property that are being conducted, not one of the designs gained 100% recognition, and the best one only achieved 92%. So I think people need to be a bit cautious when they're calculating what percentage of efficiency they're going to achieve by using these dual flush buttons. One of the standalones was the big button is always identified as the bigger flush by the population. It improves a bit if you mark the button, but I think the big bit we've identified is the difference, the contrast between the smaller button and the larger button has to be, the big button has to be about 150% the size of the smaller button to achieve an 80% level of recognition. The marking does help. If you've got buttons that the small button is the big flush, that does tend to mislead the public. even if you mark it, you're only going to get that 60% level of recognition. So the way RAS are going to tackle this moving forwards is it's not going to be that we don't grant approvals, but we're going to be more explicit in explaining our understanding of the flushes, and that will probably relate to some IRNs that we apply to the product, so installation requirement notes. So where the marking exists, if it is marked in such a way that there is a distinction between one button and the other based on the number of marks that are on the button, that we would see as being a label that's easy to understand if it's fixed on the button. If it's purely the difference in size of the marking that's on the button, we wouldn't recognize that as being good instructions by itself, and some additional information is going to be required. And that falls into the, there have to be instructions fitted on or nearby, which is what it states in the regulations. I think I've been challenged in the past asking the question, well, why don't you demand that the marking is on the product? Well, that's fine if you're marking the button or the flush mechanism. However, if you the instructions, the regulations state that it has to be marked on or nearby the cistern. So somebody could apply a label to a cistern that's a concealed cistern, and then it instantly gets shielded when the cover is put over on the concealed cistern. As far as readily discernible is concerned, RAS are looking for a level of 80% recognition, and based on all of the work that we've done, we've identified that to achieve that, we were expecting the big button to represent the big flush and the little button to represent the little flush, and there to be that 1.5 times difference in the size between the big and the small button. As I said before, because these phrases are ambiguous, RAS's interpretation doesn't mean that it's right, and water companies can take a completely different point of view to the approach that RAS are taking. But we feel that by providing more information, it may be of assistance to the user, the installer, and it will be of assistance to the regs enforcers if they're on site, because they'll be able to look at the installation requirements notes that have been applied, and it might give them some information on the type of design that's being employed. So what we're looking at is, the first one is purely for flush valves where the button isn't present when the flush valve is being assessed, because some manufacturers don't get all the flush buttons assessed as part of it, so there's some additional testing required. And then as we move down, where the button doesn't include instructions, we state what it basically states in the regulations, that it must have instructions clearly and permanently marked on the cistern or displayed nearby. So all that's doing is reiterating something that already exists in the regulations. Where the button is, the big button is the big flush and the small button is the small flush, but they're very similar in size, we're doing a slightly different IRN, which will hopefully draw to the attention of anybody using the product and installing the product what needs to be done. Where the button is, the small button is used for the large flush, in effect, that based on the research work we've done, 4 out of 5 people will get that wrong. So we're putting an IR on the product that says user of the product may find it difficult to readily discern the controls, and then information has to be provided. It's then an enforcement issue for the water company to decide whether the information provided is appropriate or not. How that's going to affect approval holders is, starting next year, we're going to be introducing these new policies. So I've had a meeting with the Bathroom Manufacturers Association already and explained some of this approach. And when we assess product, it isn't going to stop a product getting approved. What it will do is affect the IRNs that get applied to those products. And then as far as water companies are concerned, we're only applying these changes to new approvals that are being sought. I have been asked by some manufacturers about old approvals, and I'm quite happy to talk about that later on if someone wants to talk about it. The IRNs will be applied from the 1st of January. So for water companies to know whether we've applied the IRNs to that product or not, it's about the approval number that we grant. So anything that's got a number that begins 2201 or higher will have been assessed against those criteria. I think that's probably all for me.
Thank you very much, Ian, and yeah, really interesting to see how your research is being used to inform some criteria that can help sort of find a way through some of the sort of ambiguities that the legislation sort of opens up. So that was really interesting. So now we're going to move into a Q&A panel. So please, if people can be popping their questions into the Q&A box, that would be great. We're going to be joined by all the 4 speakers that we've heard from, plus Simon Warburton, who's the certification manager at NSF, who are a third testing house, and also Andy McLean from the Bathroom Manufacturers Association, who's their technical director. So we're gonna move from sharing the slides, and we're going to be hopefully on some sort of gallery view, and then I'll go through and sort of pick up any questions that are coming through. So yeah, I thought I'd start by a question for Simon and a question for Andy, because they haven't presented. So Simon, I mean, have you got any thoughts on, based on sort of what you've heard and what you've heard about the research and findings and changes that RAS are making? What do you think that means for NSF? You know, are you going to be looking to adopt a similar approach?
Well, at NSF, I mean, we're going to adopt, whatever is required going forward, really. I mean, there's been some interesting presentations, I think. This has been an issue for a number of years. We all know that. But yeah, I mean, we test to, the test criteria, that's required for RAS approval primarily, and therefore any changes that are needed to those criteria, then we will adopt those going forward.
Okay, great. And Andy from the BMA, thanks for joining the Q&A. So, I mean, ultimately, this issue sort of links back to the products and the design of the products. So, can I ask you, how are the BMA and manufacturers sort of, how do they feel about these new sort of RAS provisions? Are they useful to them? Do they think it will sort of help them in their sort of future design? To make sure this sort of issue gets signed out at source? You there, Andy? Are you on mute?
I'll put my pound in the jar, Julie. Yeah, I mean, from manufacturers' point of view, obviously any research that helps in future design of products, they will take that into account. I think the concern is that the buttons have been around for a long time. Manufacturers do research these things. They're not just sort of the concepts are researched, how they actually work, and sometimes we understand that there are concerns and that water wastage is a big issue, but we need a lot more research. Actually creating buttons is very, very expensive. And based on interpretations that we've seen today, I think we need to be very clear before manufacturers are going to start spending a lot of money on redesigns. However, that said, any research is welcomed, and as manufacturers go forward, obviously product development and new designs are at the forefront of most manufacturers in getting trends, etc. And they will feed that into their designs in future. So, let's start having this conversation. If it is a confusing issue, then I think research just needs to be a little bit deeper and provide a lot more clarity to force the change. But manufacturers, the reception was, okay, we understand where we're coming from. It is an ambiguous issue that I think we've all agreed today. But to try, I think there is a concern that these products are in the marketplace. So we would urge the water inspectors just to consider that whilst we need time to sort of move towards the change, you know, you've got to use a bit of common sense in the field. Just picking up on David's point that the discussions early on allowed for a readily discernible, i.e. a different size and shape of button was deemed as acceptable. So to suddenly make a change in the way that this is actually enforced is a little bit dangerous, and unfortunately it's the contractors and our customers that get stuck in the middle of that. So we just urge that there is a bit of common sense about this. It's great to see that Ian in his implementation is not stopping designs hitting the market. They are just looking at IRNs for installation to say, we really think that if you go down this route, there should be, for example, a label explaining what's going on. Whether the consumer removes that in the home, at least we've provided it. And I would point out that most manufacturers do already provide the labels and ask that they are actually installed, but very few are. So I think there's a change in thinking there that's needed as well.
So even though they have to be applied, the labels have to be applied, don't they, for the information to be permanent? They're not being applied. Yeah. Okay. Right. And Ian, I don't know if you want to come back there on in terms of the pace of this. So the research is really interesting, and starting to set some sort of criteria really for what the public see as discernible. Is this just going to be applying to sort of new products? Is there a sort of program where existing products that are already out there will be looked at as well?
Yeah, I think the intention for us at the moment is to do this for new products going forwards, because obviously to go back and reevaluate old approvals is quite a body of work. And one of the things that we've identified looking at that as a particular challenge is the people who are most likely to want their product reassessed under these conditions are the ones who are going to be, in effect, what RAS would deem to be readily discernible and labelled, etc. And the outcome of that is there is actually no difference to the approval listing they're going to get, because we're not going to be applying IRNs to the best product. So if somebody who had a really clearly, in RAS's opinion, discernible product, there's no real advantage for them to come back to talk to us. So I think what we're looking at potentially doing is saying that the products that meet our interpretations of readily discernible would have in the description a phrase added to the approval listing that says this product has been assessed and meets RAS's definition of readily discernible. So it's a clearer way of saying, there you go, we've assessed it. Just because we've assessed it as right, because it's ambiguous, it's not defined in the regulations, we could be way off the mark with how a water company enforcer may interpret it. But I think the fact that it's backed up by some evidence and some research gives it a bit of sort of fair support and understanding.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So thanks, Ian. So yeah, just looking at some of the questions in the Q&A box. There's a couple of questions from Mick Moran there. One for Alison about is there evidence that dual flush actually saves water, and do we actually need a different sort of mechanism, a single flush but low flush mechanism? So Alison, I don't know if you want to sort of come back on that. And then also another question from Mick about, with the best designs, we're still looking at the miss flush. So that doesn't sound very encouraging. And single flush would guarantee 100% sort of success. So it's a similar sort of question really posed by Mick to sort of both of you really about, should we persist, I suppose, with dual flush given some of these issues, or move in the direction of a sort of a lower flush single flush option? Do either of you want to sort of pick up on that point?
I can start with. So, I mean, I think we can obviously, any changes as we move forward in the future in terms of reducing the flush, we would encourage. My understanding is that you can't have the lower flush single volume and still get a proper flush when you need to, and that's why it's set at the moment as being 6 litres, unless it's got a different mechanism, like, you know, an air pushed one or something, which are on the market. So there are specialised ones on the market that will flush with less. And yes, I agree, it's more simple, but I think that in terms of the 90% rule, yes, you might not get everybody getting it right, but that's still a big improvement in comparison to the levels you get when we've surveyed people and from the survey that RAS have done. So, you know, it still moves us a long way forward if we can get to 90% recognition of which is the small flush from where we are now, even if it's not a perfect result. So I think that I'm not sure that I would say that we should move towards having a single flush unless technology changes and we're able to do that throughout. Because, and I think if we get the 90% recognition, it would save water. The data, I haven't seen any data on it, and I think it is a bit variable, as I replied. So yeah, I think I've answered the questions there.
Okay, Ian, did you want to come in on that one as well? Because it was partly addressed to you.
I was going to say, I'm very much sort of with Alison on that one. I think the whole thing is, for that position to move, you need to have a change that says this is what's required, and this, you know, whether it's a 4 litre flush, is a good enough flush to do it every single time in accordance with the tests. At the moment, generally, that's why you have the dual flush option. What you're looking for then is a way to distinguish between the two, so the operator knows what they're going to press. And I think making those changes now, while, you know, all the will in the world, if DEFRA want to change the rules and come up with some new requirements, but I think then there's the whole heap of work there for the manufacturers to develop a flush, all their flushes that will work at 4 litres.
Okay, thanks. I wanted to pick up on something that came out earlier about self-certification. As a sort of layman, what is the problem with self-certification? I mean, and is there a way that to sort of deal with it in terms of this issue about discernible dual flush buttons? How does it interface really? How does it sort of impact on self-certifiers? Does anyone, any of the testing houses, people want to?
Nathan, we know that in this area, when the regulator specification was issued some 20 years ago, the accompanying sort of letter drew reference to the fact that under the construction products regulations, or whatever it was at that time, drew reference to the fact that it was a level that required some self-certification, and it didn't need third-party certification. So manufacturers then are free to do their own in-house testing, and they are able to make the declarations. So I think we find ourselves as third-party test labs and third-party certification bodies are not seeing all the products which are coming to market. So the water companies doing enforcement are going to be faced with products that have been self-certified as being compliant. And it's the point I was trying to make in my presentation, is that it's ambiguous, right? As a certification body, RAS, Kiwa, and NSF, who have their own as well, we will make decisions on whether or not we think the product is appropriate, and whether or not the 2 points within Schedule 2 have been addressed. But the manufacturers can make their own decisions and self-declare. So you will always get that gulf. And I'm interested in actual data here. How many products are being routed through the third-party test houses? How many products are actually going through this? Because if we make a dramatic change to manufacturers' understanding on this, how much of the problem are we actually addressing? This is where I keep on talking. I'm talking about the raw data. I think we need more raw data before we create a knee-jerk reaction. No doubt there is a problem there. I'm not saying there isn't, but I think we need more data on where the flushes are taking place, because nobody has said anything about how many flushes per day happen in a public building or in a domestic building. So we have no idea where that is, where the installations are happening. Are those installations using third-party certified valves, or is it self-certified valves? Because whatever Ian, Simon and myself do, if 80% of the product that's on the market is being self-certified, right, it's down to the water companies to enforce on their understanding in each area of supply. So I think that the problem is much bigger than just certification companies trying to work together about an understanding of the two clauses in Schedule 2.
Ian, Simon, did you want to come in, or Paul, on this?
Yeah, I mean, I just completely agree with what David said there. You know, it's water companies are going to be the ones that are seeing the different options out there at the end of the day. You know, we as a certification and testing company don't see that many products, and they are mainly being self-certified. So, I mean, it's not about the flush valves per se, it's about the buttons at the end of the day that are used to actuate those valves. And yeah, I mean, you know, there's a survey being done amongst water companies about what they're seeing in the field and how ambiguous they think what they're seeing in the field is. You know, that's perhaps another approach to this.
Paul, have you got anything to add on the sort of enforcement side of things? I mean, it sounds like there's a need to raise awareness with the enforcement community, which is partly why we're doing this sort of webinar today, because we've got some of those enforcement staff on the call. Is there more that we could do to sort of raise awareness so they are sort of clear and spotting these issues when they're out doing their day job?
I think from an enforcer's perspective, this is obviously, it is an important issue, but I think against the backdrop of all of the other issues that they've got, you know, with limited resources trying to tackle, it is always going to be, you know, difficult to pick up on every type of installation and what they think they've seen and not. I think we do need to understand better, you know, what is actually being installed, what the proportions are that people think are good or bad, maybe, and maybe that is a scope of work. But just to respond to one of the comments earlier about single flush and just reducing those flushes, in this day and age, with all of the sensors that we've got, our toilet designs are relying on you know, antiquated mechanical actuations. Have we now got to a point with technology where we can use sensors? You push a button and it senses how much water it needs to flush to clear the bowl, and then that would be sufficient. You know, is there a, you know, yes, it would probably be more expensive, but if in the long run it does, you know, it does save it and make it easier, then maybe that's an alternative way forward. Just a thought. Okay,
a linked question, Alison, that Tim's asked, and actually you've got your hand up as well. Tim Wagstaff has asked, you know, are we seeing enough? Is this enough action? And what are the actions you think water companies could take next? Do we need an awareness campaign on dual flush buttons, or greater enforcement effort or attention?
I think what we're trying to do is there's going to be a number of steps, and we're not saying that any one thing is going to cure it all. But I think it will drive change the more we do on this, and more people start seeing if they start seeing different buttons with different designs that are clearer. I think that would all move things along, and in terms of education and in terms of future designs and the direction it will go. So I think that just because we might not be able to tackle everything shouldn't mean we shouldn't start. And I think I would, and I'm not sure when you say David says additional research is needed. I mean, that would be useful, of course, but I think what's been done from RAS is really clear, and it had really clear outcomes. And I'm not sure what additional research would achieve in those terms, in terms of what the public recognise, in terms of the difference in size of the buttons and what's labelled. I'm not sure how much more that would help, really. I think it was really quite striking, really, what the outcome was, even though we didn't get the 90% much more than 90% with any one of them. But it was certainly sufficient to help for us to be able to understand what the public see is readily discernible, and you know, welcome to understand what specifically you mean by that. And I think the just final point I make about domestic versus public, I don't know. Yes, I think it might be more of a problem in public toilets that are regularly, you know, where people would different. But I also think that you can't say it's not a problem in domestic, because the surveys that we did and the surveys quite clearly showed that even if they're using that toilet every day, doesn't mean that they understand which button is which. And they're consistently getting it wrong. And that's what we have heard when we go into people's homes and we ask them about it. They will think that that they're supposed to press that the little small one that's inside the big one to get the small flush. And they will comment about the fact that they can't always and then when they press that one, both of them goes down, which confuses them. So it's definitely not just a problem that's associated with non-domestic settings. So yes, I think there's more that can be done across the board, but we need to start, and then we need to start moving in the right direction here, rather than not tackling it at all.
Thanks, thanks, Alison. And I've got Andy. Andy and David have both got their hands up, so I'll come to Andy first.
Yeah, just making sure my mic's on. Yeah, just to point out that, you know, manufacturers do a lot of research when they've come out with these buttons. And I think the onus of a lot of the research has been on, can you identify? Now, the manufacturers actually, so when you talk about the small buttons inside the big buttons and they both go down, they will actually default to the small flush. So if you press that big one, even though they both move, if you press the small button and they both move, it will default to the small flush. So I think you're right, Alison, that there is an understanding there, but the manufacturers have designed it in such a way that that is actually going to default to the smaller flush if they don't understand what they're doing. The other point I was going to make is that, you know, a lot of homeowners will understand how to activate the small and the full flush. And I think, you know, times have moved on, the education, people understand that there are dual flush, and they will actually learn, in our experience and manufacturers' experience, they will actually learn, certainly in a domestic environment, how to use it. The other thing is that, you know, to present somebody with a new button, you're never going to achieve 100%. Doesn't matter what that design is going to be, you won't achieve 100%. Some of the figures that Ian has actually presented, you know, represent the larger parts of the buttons that are actually in the market. I mean, so they will act, and they've sort of got the 80%, etc. So, you know, there's just some sweeping statements that are being made, and we just need to sort of temper that. And we do get that there is an issue, and some button designs are confusing. But whilst it's confusing, the manufacturers have also built in that there are defaults to the lesser flushes if you don't know what you're doing. And I think that is the sort of thing where we'd expect a little bit more research. Why do people not understand? What are they actually thinking it's going to do? So from our point of view, that's where our members have sort of said, we'd like a little bit more research just to understand from that point of view.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think research would be useful, but some of the solutions to this look very simple in terms of just the marking of the buttons. And I know you're saying it takes a while to change designs, etc. And this will be a sort of gradual process, but the actual some of the solutions just seem like sort of common sense, really.
Just putting the label on the button is going to make a massive difference. If that doesn't happen in installation, things like that will make a big difference. We totally get that.
Yeah, David, you've had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, I think Alison and Andy have addressed some of the things I wanted to say, but I think what else is not being answered here is what is driving the need for these confusing designs. We've seen some designs that, I would say to the majority of people, they can see a small button, small flush, right? But there are, even though I have one at home, we have the press and the press note. It is confusing. So why is that being driven? What is that being driven by the specification market wanting these small niche designs? Or is it the manufacturers who believe that they are selling a better product? Where is the need for these confusing designs? Where is this coming from? And that's not being answered for me.
Does anyone know the answer or have a view on where the answer is? Is it the designers, the architects, trying to come up with nifty, nice looking sort of products that
I just believe we need to get
not very functional?
Problem.
No, I don't think anyone wants to come back with the answer on that. But I'd like to sort of flag another question really about, it's obviously going to take time to get this issue sorted out. There may be some areas where there's some new research, changes of designs, etc. People don't change their toilets very often, so it's not going to be a quick fix for this. So what can we do in the meantime? As a group, the solution should be in the hands really of the sort of organisations that are on this call. So what can we do in the next year or so to actually try and reduce basically the amount of wastage that is going on out there linked to misuse of these buttons? So does anyone want to come in with any sort of thoughts on what we can do in the sort of short term while designs change and while some of the testing processes are sort of reviewed and looked at?
I think Alison probably touched on something earlier on, which is about this just raising awareness, whether it's water companies raising awareness through their customer base, whether it's manufacturers raising awareness or certification bodies raising awareness through news articles, etc. But I think, to me, what was quite apparent was there was, based on the research that we have done, is there was this understanding. I can't remember how David described those ones. We've tended to come up with the phrase counterintuitive, little button for a big flush. Those counterintuitive ones, to me, seem to be where the biggest problem lays on the survey work we did. And as David mentioned, I don't know whether that's specifiers and designers driving the argument or whether it's manufacturers. But in a way, it's that obstacle that I think is the biggest one that needs to be overcome and will have the biggest impact on new designs coming through. I think kind of touching back on one of your questions from earlier on about self-certification versus approval schemes, third-party approval schemes. I think the over-the-counter jobbing plumber will buy the toilet over the counter in whichever plumbing merchant he wants to go to. When it comes to the new build market, that's where you tend to find the specifiers asking for something else, whether it's a certification scheme mark or some additional verification. I think that's probably where there's work that can be done there. We've already started doing some work with the Home Builders Federation to try and see what their understanding is, because that's the specifier end of the market. But obviously, I think it's probably the manufacturers having those discussions internally to see whether there's things they can do at the other end, and hopefully the two will mesh together nicely somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, I mean, Andy, last year you ran, or earlier this year, you ran the Lavi Savvy campaign, didn't you, which was really successful. Well, it's award-winning, I think, now. And maybe there's a need to really do something, you know, like that on this issue, because I know that campaign was more focused on sort of leakage and looking after your toilet, the sort of maintenance side of things. But maybe we need to do something similar, and you know, across the different organisations that are here today and the other sort of water companies that are, etc., that are attending it. We could do something in the next 12 months to raise awareness, you know, just in the toilets that are already out there, trying to encourage customers, users to sort of use them, or help them use them correctly.
Yeah, it's great. And I mean, the discussions that we're having are obviously starting to raise the profile of this, which is great for reducing the number of people that actually use the wrong flush. And so I think the more attention it gets, and we'd certainly, and I'm sure members would support a campaign that would just simply ask the question, do you know how to operate your small flush? And it's literally just getting somebody to say, oh, I don't know, how do I operate it? And just, if you press it a certain way, you get a longer duration of flush than, so it lasts longer than if you press it another certain way. And I think there's little things like that to answer the question, what can we do in the interim, you know, that would certainly help. So we could certainly look at promoting just asking that question, really. And I mean, the other thing is, I agree with Ian that there are some counterintuitive designs out there, but I have to say that the majority are easily understandable. And I think it's a minority that are causing bigger headaches than they need to, let's say. So, I mean, we could certainly, I think there's things that we can work with the water company and Alison, you know, maybe we just need to put our heads together to literally just ask the question, do you know how to operate your small flush? I think the bigger challenge is in commercial environments where people, as the research does, as I mentioned earlier, is a problem where they're suddenly confronted by something that they don't understand. And I think the key thing there, again, in the interim, is making sure that the stickers that are supplied, you know, are actually used. As I say, a lot of manufacturers supply the stickers, but they're never really installed. And I think particularly commercial environments are where they should be.
Yeah, I think I'll go back to, I do think that it would be better if the design is clear enough that you don't need the stickers. I do come across a lot in the commercial sector where they do tend to be the ones where they've got separate buttons and that, because in order to make it very clear, and therefore I don't think there's so much of an issue. But and a campaign would be great, and it's and if we can, I think what's really good here is that we are pretty much all in agreement there is an issue to be solved. Maybe we've got slightly differing viewpoints on how we get there, but so yeah, and I think momentum is building on this, and it will require talking to different groups like the house builders, as well as government and manufacturers. And yes, very happy to talk to you, Andy, and yeah, this is one of my pet topics. I do like to talk about it. I was just going to mention that one of the reasons we identified why people were pressing the wrong button, even when it was clear size difference, is that they thought that the bigger button might be the small flush because it's the one that they want you to press, is what we quoted. So you know, and therefore the education thing will always be needed, but if you can add the droplets to that button, then you will overcome that. So you know, if you've got both the size difference and then it labeled on the thing, then you're very then close to getting that high percentage. So yeah, and I heard people discussing it following the Waterwise conference on the radio, and that's what some people said, and it seemed to be a bit of an 80-20 split in that way, that 80% of people expected the small button to be the small flush, but 20% or 10-20% thought the opposite for the reason I've just said. So it's very interesting how people think, and we do need to overcome that, and however we need to do it drive things in the right direction, yeah, I think we will get there.
Okay. I'll just ask the panelists if there's any last thoughts or comments that you'd like to make, because I'm going to end the webinar there. So just before we do that, does anybody want to say any sort of got any final comments or things that you'd like to sort of commit to doing going forward over the next sort of six months or so? Anybody? No.
Well, I think I kind of wrapped up really.
Yeah,
what I just said. So I think I'll pass over to the others.
Well, I was going to say, if I kick off, I think I've kind of explained what RAS approvals are likely to be doing. Our next step, so we're going to be publishing our approach about an ambiguity in the regulations on the website, and as we've started doing, we'll wherever we identify these ambiguities, we're communicating it off to DEFRA as well, so that they're aware of the issue, so that should they choose to do anything in the future about those tests or those statements, it's kind of a compendium of all the things that have been identified that they can start working through.
Thanks, Ian.
Yeah, I think I would reiterate what the comments have been saying earlier about, I think there is a need for a consumer campaign and some information. And I think that's something, the industry could work with others if we had, small videos, things like that, and raised why it's important, the amounts that are wasted, make those links back to our, because environmental, issues are a significant issue, and this, plays to that.
Alison, I don't know whether that's a legacy hand or a new hand. What's up? No, it's gone.
Oh, I pressed that by mistake, sorry.
Okay, no problem. Anybody else want to say any sort of closing words? No. Well, I'm going to bring the session to a close now. It's been really interesting, really quite a lively discussion with lots of different sort of a few different sort of perspectives on it as well. I think there's a consensus that there is an issue around confusing dual flush buttons, and that we do want to solve it. We do want to find a way to avoid water being wasted, to help meet these environmental challenges and water supply challenges that we face. The evidence, I think, from the RAS public survey that they've undertaken and the previous ones are that there is confusion out there. And it's great that, I think it's great that they're proactively using that information to improve their approvals processes. And speaking as Waterwise, I'd urge the other testing houses to take a serious sort of look at whether they can use that information to inform changes to their own processes as well. Ultimately, we do need to see the problem designed out, and with some relatively small changes, that would seem to be possible, so that we avoid the problem in the first place. So, I would urge the manufacturers on the call and the BMA and all of us really to sort of encourage the manufacturers and designers to crack on and do that. And finally, I think we all recognise that these improvements are going to take a while to filter through, because people aren't changing their toilets very often. So I think we still need the water companies and the BMA and Waterwise and some of the others on the call to be working together on raising awareness with customers, and I hope we can sort of do that and get that going over the next 6 months. And also for water companies to be working with their own enforcement people to raise awareness of this issue, so that they spot it when they're out and about. So finally, I'd like to thank all the speakers and the panelists today, and to thank Laura, who's been running the webinar behind the scenes as well. I'd like to thank all the attendees for joining. Hope you've enjoyed the webinar and found it useful and interesting, and that you have an enjoyable and restful Christmas. So So thank you very much for joining us, and we'll hopefully be sending out the recording in the next week.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Thank you.